There are moments in political life when the mask slips. Not in some dramatic public meltdown, not in some viral clip that gets passed around for a news cycle and forgotten, but quietly in the slow accumulation of small recognitions that something is not what it was sold as. That is what is happening right now in Virginia. And I have to tell you, watching it unfold, watching the realization settle over the very voters who put Abigail Spanberger in the governor's mansion just months ago, none of it surprises me. Not one bit. Because when you build a campaign on a carefully manufactured persona, eventually the persona cracks. And when it does, the people who believed in it have nowhere to put their disappointment except squarely on themselves. Let's go back, because to understand the buyer's remorse setting in across the Commonwealth right now, you have to understand the sale that was made. November 2025. Spanberger is on stage in Richmond delivering her victory speech. She has just defeated winsome Earl Sears by a comfortable margin. She is wearing the suburban mom meets CIA analyst uniform that has been her brand from day one. She talks about lowering costs. She talks about working across the aisle. She talks about being a problem solver, not a partisan. She invokes her time in federal law enforcement. She mentions her 3 daughters. She thanks the moderate Republicans and the independents who crossed over to vote for her. And she promises, and I want you to remember this word because it matters, she promises she will govern for all Virginians. That was the pitch, the whole pitch. Pragmatic, centrist, grown-up. The adult in the room after 4 years of what her ads called Glenn Youngkin's culture war distractions. And it worked. It worked in Loudoun County. It worked in Chesterfield. It worked in the Virginia Beach precincts that had gone for Youngkin in 2021. She ran 9 points ahead of where a generic Democrat would have run in those places. And she did it by convincing hundreds of thousands of Virginians who had been skeptical of her party that she was different, that she was not what they feared. That was the moment you could see, if you were paying attention, exactly what the strategy was. The strategy was to look like a Republican to suburban moderates and govern like a progressive once the door closed behind her. And that is precisely what has happened. Let's talk about what those voters are waking up to. Because the receipts are now in. Within her first 6 weeks in office, Spanberger signed executive orders on sanctuary policies for state agencies that her campaign had explicitly disavowed. When a reporter asked her in October whether she would direct state agencies to limit cooperation with federal immigration enforcement, she said, and I am quoting from the debate transcript, that she had no plans to change existing policy. No plans. 6 weeks later, Executive Order 4. The exact policy she said she had no plans to enact. Signed before the second snowfall of her term. Then came the tax pledge. The single most repeated line of her campaign. She would not raise taxes on working Virginians. She said it in 3 debates. She said it in a closing ad that ran 9,000 times across the Commonwealth in the final 2 weeks. She said it directly to the camera, looking the voter in the eye, in a spot that her own campaign described internally as their most effective piece of paid media. And then, in February, her budget proposal arrived in the General Assembly, a new tier on the state income tax. A vehicle miles traveled fee that hits rural drivers hardest. A reassessment trigger on commercial property that will pass straight through to small business tenants. Her press team called it a modernization of the revenue code. The voters in Hanover County who pulled the lever for her because of that one ad call it something else. And now let's talk about what has emerged on the social policy front, because this is where the deception becomes impossible to spin. Spanberger spent the entire general election running away from her own party's national platform on parental notification in schools. She told a town hall in Henrico that she believed parents had a right to be informed about major decisions involving their children. She used the phrase common sense partnership between schools and families. Her campaign cut a 30-second spot showing her at a kitchen table with 2 mothers discussing exactly that. The spot ran in heavy rotation in the Richmond and Hampton Roads markets for the final 3 weeks. In March, Her Department of Education issued new guidance to local school divisions that effectively reverses the Youngkin-era model policies on parental notification for gender identity decisions. The guidance does not require notification. It frames notification as potentially harmful to the student. It directs school counselors to use professional judgment, which everyone in education understands is bureaucratic code for do not tell the parents unless legally compelled. The kitchen table ad has been quietly pulled from her official campaign archive. I checked. It is gone. You can see why the buyer's remorse is setting in. You can see why the talk radio call-in lines in the Tidewater are jammed every morning. You can see why the moderate suburban Democrats who held their nose and voted for her are now telling pollsters they feel, and this is the word that keeps coming up in focus groups commissioned by both parties, used. They feel used. Because they were. I want to be precise here, because precision matters. Politicians moderate their rhetoric in campaigns. That is not new. Every candidate in every era has tacked toward the center in October and governed somewhat differently in February. That is not the indictment. The indictment is the scale and the specificity of the reversals. When a candidate looks directly into a camera and makes a numbered, dateable, verifiable promise, and then within 90 days of taking office does the precise opposite of that promise, that is not normal political triangulation. That is something else. And the voters know the difference. They have always known the difference. They are not the rubes that the consultant class in Arlington seems to think they are. Some of her defenders have pushed back on this framing. They say circumstances change. They say a governor has to respond to the situation in front of her. They say the federal landscape under the new Trump administration forced her hand on immigration. That is a fine argument if you want to make it. But here is what is not a fine argument. The federal landscape did not force her to rewrite a tax pledge she made 11 times on camera. The federal landscape did not force her to gut a parental notification policy she had personally praised in a Loudoun County town hall. Those were choices, made deliberately, made early, made by a governor who calculated that the voters who put her in office had no recourse for the next 4 years and could be safely betrayed. That is the part that should infuriate every Virginian who crossed over to vote for her. Not the policies themselves, although the policies are bad enough. The contempt, the implicit assumption that you, the voter, were too unsophisticated to read the signals, that you would never check the receipts, that by the time the reversals piled up, you would have moved on to the next news cycle and forgotten what you were promised. That is the assumption that underlies every move her administration has made since January, and it is the assumption that is now beginning to curdle. The polling tells the story. Her approval rating among self-identified independents has dropped 22 points since inauguration. Among the suburban women who were her decisive demographic, it has dropped 16. The Roanoke College poll out last week showed that 41% of voters who supported her in November now say they regret their vote. 41%. In 4 months. That is not a slow drift. That is a collapse in real time. I want to address something directly because I know how these conversations get framed. The case against Spanberger is not the case some of her loudest critics want to make. It is not about her gender. It is not about her family. It is not about her time at the agency, which by all accounts was honorable. Some of the people who will take what I am saying and run with it will use it to score the cheaper, uglier kind of point. They will go after her appearance, her marriage, her daughters. That is wrong. The case I am making is not that case. You can believe Abigail Spanberger has betrayed the voters who elected her and still believe that she is a person of basic decency in her private life. Those two things are not in conflict. The critique is about the conduct of the office. It is about what was promised and what was delivered. That is the only critique that matters, and it is the only critique that needs to be made, because it is more than sufficient. The reckoning is now arriving. You can hear it in the way the General Assembly Democrats from competitive districts have started to distance themselves from her budget. You can hear it in the way the editorial boards that endorsed her are now writing pieces with titles like "A Question of Trust." You can hear it in the quiet conversations in the office parks of Reston, where the federal contractors who made up the spine of her coalition are realizing that the woman they elected to defend their interests against the new administration in Washington is too busy delivering for the Progressive Caucus in Richmond to take their phone calls. The Richmond debate stage in October was the first warning sign. The hand on the heart pledge on taxes was the warning sign. The kitchen table ad with the two mothers was the warning sign. The promise to govern for all Virginians was the warning sign. Each of those moments, in retrospect, was a tell, a glimpse of the gap between the persona and the person. The voters could not see it then because they were not looking for it. They were looking for relief from a campaign cycle they were exhausted by, and she gave them a face that promised relief, and they took it. Time has a way of clarifying these things. The face has come off. What stands behind it is a politician who ran one campaign and is governing another, who said one thing under oath of campaign and is doing the opposite under oath of office, who calculated that the voters of Virginia could be told one story in October and handed a different story in February without consequence. That calculation is now being tested, and the early returns suggest she calculated wrong. History will not remember Abigail Spanberger the way her consultants hoped. It will not remember her as the moderate problem solver who united a divided Commonwealth. It will remember her as the candidate who ran as one thing and governed as another, and whose voters, the very ones who put her in office on the strength of her word, figured it out faster than anyone in her inner circle thought they would. The bill for that miscalculation is now coming due. It will be paid in the midterms. It will be paid in the down-ballot races. It will be paid in the trust that the voters of this Commonwealth, having been burned once, will not extend lightly the next time someone in a navy blazer stands at a podium in Richmond and tells them she is different. They thought she was different. They were wrong, and they know it now.